Let's pull together. We're in the home stretch. Woo-hoo! All right, I want to talk about textual criticism. So, criticism is not a negative word. When you see criticism, really think of it as study or analysis. So, when we talk about textual criticism, what we're talking about is the science and study of this period of time that we referred to earlier. So this process of this period after about 400 BC, the canon's intact, and now the job of the believing community is to hand copy meticulously and push forward God's holy, inspired, authoritative word to the next generation. So textual criticism is basically, from our vantage point, really a historical study of that process of the believing community. And what we'll talk about is it's a study of what we call the witnesses and the versions. The witnesses of God's word are the Hebrew hand copies of the text. So the hand copies, but produced in Hebrew. So one Hebrew text copied into Hebrew. So those are called the witnesses. And we have the witnesses, basically three groups that we'll talk about here in a minute. The other part that we'll talk about are called versions. The versions are the translations into some other language from Hebrew, but copied nonetheless. We referred to earlier the Septuagint into Greek or the Latin Vulgate, so we'll talk about those. Sometimes the translations would have a little bit of New Living Word, a little bit of an amplification added to them, thrown in, but we'll talk about that. So first, though, we'll talk about the witnesses. The three witnesses. First, the Masoretic text. We call this the MT. Sometimes you see it. The time period is 500 to about 1000 AD. The Masoretic scribes were at work preserving very meticulously the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. They were the ones responsible for adding we call them the vocalization or the vowel markings to the Hebrew consonantal text. And that was for the purposes of preserving the spokenness of the Old Testament. They would speak out loud and memorize amazing chunks of the Old Testament, but they would preserve the vocalization for the purposes of reading. We have the oldest complete manuscript that we call it the Leningrad Codex, and it serves as basically the foundation for what we have as our modern Hebrew Bibles, the BHH that we call it, or the Hebrew text. So
what did you say it was called?
The Leningrad Codex. That's the oldest complete manuscript that we have of the Hebrew Bible. So the next we talk about the Samaritan Pentateuch, pictured here in the middle. And you remember the Samaritans, those who were part of the original kind of left behinds of the takeover of Samaria, the capital city of Israel, the northern kingdom, at the hands of the Assyrians. The Samaritans were left over and then became, when the faithful Jews came back from Persia, they met up with the Samaritans again. So there was this conflict. But the Samaritans were preserving the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. There's hand copies of the Pentateuch that go back to, basically, it preserves the early 4th century BC text of the Pentateuch. So it's pretty old. But unfortunately, it's just the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So we can use that as a research tool as well. And then we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have some of those on I think they're in a safe place, but on site. And these are 221 texts or fragments from the Old Testament, dated from about 250 BC to about 135 AD. The Dead Sea Scrolls are collections of all the books of the Old Testament except for the book of Esther. The book of Esther is not represented in any of the surviving Dead Sea Scrolls. So what we're going to have here with regards to the witnesses, again, all of these are copies in Hebrew, but these become foundational, you might say, comparison sources. Sources for text that we can basically compare one to another, and that becomes the science of textual criticism. It's really kind of an interesting study. Now moving on to the witnesses. Again, these are translations from the original Hebrew, but copies nonetheless. First, the most famous is the Septuagint, or the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And that one goes back to 250 to about 100 BC. Broadly speaking, this involved about 72 scholars who knew Greek and Hebrew, working to translate various books. And when you study this at length, if you move into this as a field of interest later on or read on it, you'll learn that these translators each had their own unique translation technique or style. So the translator of Isaiah may have been a little different than the translator of Jeremiah, but nonetheless, there's translation techniques that we study with regards to this particular part of the science. So again, what you're having to do, if you study the Septuagint, and let's say you're studying a book like Isaiah in the Septuagint, and comparing, what you'll do is compare that to the Masoretic text. And you'll notice that there might be differences in word spellings, or maybe an occasional added word, and that becomes the science of textual transmission. The Aramaic Targums, during a time when the Old Testament was orally read and translated, this is a practice that goes all the way back to Ezra in the time of in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 8, verse 8. This is an oral translation and reading of the text, and this activity was translated into Aramaic for each of the books of the Old Testament, which is the spoken language of the Assyrian Empire. Every book had its own Targum, except for Daniel and the books of Ezra and Nehemiah by about 518 BC. And then finally the Vulgate. This is the Latin translation of the Old Testament, and it dates back to 250 AD. So what we end up having are the versions and the witnesses of the Old Testament. And the science of textual criticism is basically the science of comparing all of the above, versions and translations, for the purposes of locating, you might say, the original text from the author of the Old Testament. It's kind of like sonar location, or what bats use to kind of get through the caves. They triangulate the signals, and they have the way of figuring out, finding things in the dark, and then all of a sudden it's there. So this is kind of like cleanup work, you might say. From the time of the close of the canon, from about 400 BC, we have these sources of copies, whether they're the original witness or the versions of the Old Testament, for the purposes of comparison. But then the end game is to reconstruct, as best we can, the original text of the Old Testament. The good news is there's not a lot of massive cleanup work necessary. We're really talking about a small percentage in comparison. But here we have a picture of a scribe. So again, like I said before, this involves non-inspired work, hand copying. You could have human error along the way. The kinds of errors that scribes would commit. Basically, you can picture errors of sight and sound. So if you have this scribe who is either seeing something and copying it from sight, or he's hearing somebody read something and he's committing errors of sound. So there's three that I give you here. First would be letter confusion. In Hebrew, certain letters have similar shapes and could be confused. So in the copying process, words would be misspelled, for example. Another one, this is a fancy word called haplography. Haplography. And that's simply error of omission. Sometimes a scribe would just skip over and leave out a letter or a word completely in the hand copying process. Another fancy word we talk about is dittography. That's another error scribes would commit. This was an error not of omission, but an error of addition. Here they'd add an extra letter or a word. Again, this comes back to errors of sight or errors of hearing. So the science of textual criticism, again, is basically lining up the Masoretic text. That's our primary text. So the general rule of thumb, if you get into this, always go with the Masoretic text and what it says, unless a good argument can be made from a combination of any of the other sources, whether they be versions or the witnesses. So the science of textual criticism is you're kind of like a lawyer making a case to prove somebody either innocent or guilty. So if you can identify one of these things, it's not that you're disagreeing with the Word of God. You're just basically saying, hey, I found a scribal error, and you're identifying it and then making that correction. So that's what we see. In the Masoretic text, the Masoretic scribes actually would add a column and would include their recommendations for the corrections that they found based on their work as Masoretic scribes, if they were able to find them. So that's what we have with regards to this textual criticism. Now, here's just an example of some of the categories that we've just talked about. So this particular text here comes out of first Isaiah, and what we're doing here is comparing the Masoretic text with the variant that shows up here in this first line, an example from a Qumran text of the same passage out of Isaiah. So the Masoretic text, the Lord shall make heard, but the variant that we see in Qumran, the Lord shall make heard. So obviously that's an example of words that are written twice, the idea of dittography. So that's that category. Another category, the Masoretic text, I will leave the corpses of the Philistine army. And then a variant comes here, in this case out of the Greek translation, I will leave your corpse and the corpses of the Philistine army. And in this case, we have an example of a word that's omitted. So what you're doing is taking these, the variants, and then finding them in other copies, whether they be witnesses or versions, and then making your case to say, well, it might be that the Masoretic text needs to be corrected or amended. But again, it's just a small example or a small portion that we have really at the end of the day. Is there a textual problem is really the question that we might ask ourselves. And in this case, here we have a statement from Gleason Archer. He says, the text from Qumran proved to be word for word identical to our standard Hebrew Bible in more than 95% of the text. The 5% of variation consisted primarily of obvious slips of the pen and spelling alterations in some of the categories that we've talked about. So that gives you an idea of really what we're talking about. So for example, you can compare the Masoretic text with the Qumran text of, say, an entire chapter, like Isaiah 53. So just as an example, you're looking at, in chapter 53, 166 words. Of those words, 17 letters are different. 10 end up being spelling differences. 4 end up being stylistic changes. And then 3 are all from an added word, the Hebrew word for light in verse 11. So that kind of gives you an example of what you end up coming up with when you do this comparison. But at the end of the day, it's safe to say none of these differences end up with major, there's not theological error, it doesn't change the major meaning and the theological message of the books at the end of the day. You're only talking about slight differences. So that's a whole field of study if any of you feel called to go into the do your doctoral dissertation in an area of textual criticism, there's a lot of work to be done out there. Wouldn't you agree, Adam? A lot of work to be done. Yeah.
Lord bless you if you choose that.
All right. Well, hey, let's keep going just a little bit longer here. So another thing that we can talk about lightly. Now we'll be talking about this throughout the course of the semester as things come up. But one, you talk about the reliability of the Old Testament as it speaks to matters of history. One of the problems or challenges that we have from the Old Testament, for example, is that we don't have a cave that we've discovered in the ancient world that has on it graffiti that says Abraham was here. It's just not there. There's a whole the history of Genesis, for example, during this time period where God's people were nomadic and followed the herds and found the green grassy areas to feed their livestock. They weren't building cities, So we don't have a lot to go on in the early historical part like we'd want to have. So we, until cities were starting to be built, when the United Kingdom got established and kings started building cities, and now we can go back and do archaeology at Tel Gezer and discover things about the ancient cities, and we can validate what the Bible says, right? But sometimes it's a little bit more challenging. So what I'm going to do here is just, in the time that we have left, is just show you a few examples of some interesting discoveries. I think they're interesting, and I'll call them by name. The first one is called Ketef Hinnom Scrolls, and this is helpful because in 1979, in a burial chamber and near the old city of Jerusalem, this was a scroll that was very tightly wound up, and it was worn as an amulet around the neck of its owner. It took the scholars, the experts, 3 years to unwind this thing. That's how tightly it was wound up. But in the day, they would take it out of its amulet, its container, and they would read it. And in this case, what we have in the Ketef Hinnom scroll is a portion of the book of Numbers. Numbers chapter 6, verse 24 through 26. We have what's called the Aaronic blessing, or Aaron's benediction. We have the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and give you peace. Come on, sing along. And give you peace. Yeah, it's that blessing, right? It's a beautiful song, and it was written in poetic form, probably meant to be sung as a blessing. Maybe parents singing it to their children as they put them to bed at night, just like what we did and what my mom did when I was a kid growing up. It's this wonderful blessing, but it comes in this scroll. It's really interesting. So you could see that it represents, and it dates back to about the 7th century BC. So this represents the oldest biblical text that we've currently found and discovered. It comes 400 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's pretty significant. But basically it speaks to a long-standing written tradition of the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. Text that would have been available to the believing community and used in various ways to encourage and share God's truth amongst a very functional tool, a little amulet. Bible memory verses. What do? We put them on our refrigerator doors on a 3x5 card, right? Or we post them on Post-it notes around our house. It's the same kind of thing the believing community was doing then. The next one is called the Tel Dan inscription. This was discovered in 1993. It was a portion of a monument with an inscription on it that actually states House of David. And in the line just below, it references to the reference is King in Israel. So what we have here, the significance is, this is in a day when critical scholars of the Old Testament sometimes question David's even existence as a real king in Israel, believe it or not. There are some critical scholars out there. This is evidence in the favor of, King David was a real king. And this is outside of the Bible, so this is a non-biblical reference to a king in Israel named David. So that's why it's significance. That's its significance. This next one is Kirvet Kiafa inscription, another inscription. And in 2008, not too long ago, near where David defeated Goliath, we have this text on a piece of broken pottery, of all things. And that's kind of what it looks like. This would be called generally kind of Proto-Hebrew, an earlier version of the actual way that they formed the, in this case, just the consonant letters only. But the Proto-Hebrew would be early versions of the actual Hebrew script that they were writing. And this goes back, let's see. This was discovered at a military outpost. Probably came from the time period of the 11th to the 10th century, really during that same time period of King David and King Solomon. So during that time period of the United Monarchy, this was the Hebrew script that was apparently being used by the common people of the day. This was written on, and back then they didn't have, paper necessarily like we do to write letters, but they break a pot and write on the edge of a pot and send that with the messenger to the next city. That's how they transfer messages back and forth. So this is what was going on. And again, it just shows you, here's, this is the oldest example that we have of early written Hebrew. And it also shows, early evidence of scribal activity. People who could write and knew how to write and communicate in written form. So this was an early version of that. So now, I think what I want to do is music to your ears. I want to stop here. And what we'll do is next week, what I want you to be prepared for is in week 3, the week 3 folder in Blackboard, there'll be a short recording on what we're going to talk about, and what I'll record is my discussion of the Old Testament and the development of Old Testament study or higher criticism, kind of the history of the study of the Old Testament from Europe and into modern times. So that'll be something you can watch on your own. We'll have the week 3 quiz posted, so that'll all be for next week, and you can work on that at your convenience next week. So don't come to class next week. It's, what is it, Labor Day? Labor Day. So enjoy that day, but you'll have some work to do next week on your own. So thanks for your attention tonight and for your questions from home. And thanks, Adam, for facilitating the questions. And we're off to a good start. So thanks, everybody.